Juan Pablo, thank you so much for dialing in from Patagonia,
Mhm.
the other side of this long chain of mountain ranges and rivers and two connected continents. And we're also connected by a very particular set of questions, and I think also a set of problematics that mobilize changes in our spiritual practice. And
Yeah.
I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about your own trajectory, first countering the Dharma, training in Asia, and then
Mm.
shifting to the work with indigenous ways of knowledge that you're doing now.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Damsho, and thank you for your community for inviting me. I feel very honored. And yeah, well, I started practicing. Uh, First, I started with yoga. So I started with the body, you know, and that was my gate entrance to other spiritualities. So I grew up in Colombia, uh, where, as you know, violence and war is how we grew up. It's so immersed in what we do, it's so immersed in suffering and violence and war, but also beauty. Colombia is, I think, one of the most diverse countries in the world. So you have those two uh, facets of Colombia, those two faces, for one side of violence and war, and the other side of beauty and nature, abundant nature. So that's where I grew up, and I think that started a question in me, first about violence. So I started with yoga. I started to search, and my searching journey started with yoga and with the body, and then I started to teach and learn yoga in different countries in South America. And then I found Buddhism, first Tibetan Buddhism in the Drukpa Kagyu tradition here in Argentina with Gerardo Aut, which was a big revelation for me because I was trying to practice with the body, but all the Tibetan and the Drukpa Kagyu tradition started to teach me a lot about to train my mind, and that's how I started Buddhism. And I practiced for some time. I did my non-drew practices in the Drukpa Kagyu tradition, the preliminary practices. Um, and then it started, I started to question myself about, we're talking about these social conditions of suffering. Uh, and that's something that I think it's related to my childhood in Colombia, but also in Argentina, where I was living. So I started to question how my practice related to those social and structural conditions of injustice, of poverty, and I didn't find much answers in my sangha, really, because mostly the main answer was like, or the way to address that issue was like, okay, that's kind of samsara, Samsara is conditionality, and conditionality is suffering, and that's how they approach that question or that issue. So I started to study with other people who were related to the theology of liberation in the Catholic Church. I started to work and also teach yoga and meditation in those neighborhoods where theology of liberation was very present, in the parroquias. How do you say it? In the parochies, or, well, in the churches. And it was a big revelation for me to see how they were assuming their own religion and their own tradition, but responding to the structural conditions of injustice that they saw in those neighborhoods in Argentina, in Buenos Aires particularly. I was living in Buenos Aires at that time. So I started to read theology of liberation, philosophy of liberation also, a philosophy that was made here in Latin America. And I started to question my own practice, to see how my practice responded to those social, economic, and political conditions. And that's where my journey began to read other sources of Buddhism, like David Loy or Gary Snyder, who were responding to the social but also the ecological predicament of the ecological crisis. So that's how I started to think not just about the social, the human, but also the more than human and the other than human suffering. And yeah, and that's what I do now. I am doing now like a PhD dissertation where I'm trying to think all these issues, and including what we are trying to think today, the relationship between Buddhism and indigenous systems of knowledge, or Buddhism and animism. That's how many anthropologists call some of the indigenous systems of knowledge.
When you were looking at the resources within Buddhism
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about its relationship with animism, I wonder if you could maybe start us off with a working definition of animism, and then talk
Yeah.
about where you see Buddhism and animism in relationship to one another.
Hmm. So, um, you know that animism is a category that was used in anthropology very early in the end of the 19th century. I think it was coined by Edward Taylor, a British anthropologist. And he used the term in a pejorative way to, I don't know, to categorize the indigenous beliefs and what he called primitive people beliefs that were kind of in contrast with the scientific worldview or with the mechanistic worldview. So he used the term animism to qualify these people, beliefs of these people, and he called it beliefs. Beliefs is not like we do today or in the last 20 years with indigenous ontologies. We call it ontologies because they have their own right to say what is the world, but then they call it beliefs, and it was kind of pejorative to mention or to qualify or to categorize the beliefs in spirits, in something that is not seen, the spirits of the land, the spirits of the trees, the spirits of the forest. So it was, and he called it like a childish belief. You call it like that, right? Childish. So
Mhm.
uh, so it was kind of an in the evolution of the human race. For him, it was kind of a primitive stage, and that's how the term was born. It was a pejorative term, but then, like, I think the first author that started to take the term in a more positive way was Irving Hallowell. I think he was a Canadian or I think he was a Canadian anthropologist, but he he did his field work with the Ojibwa people, and he started to say that this kind of way of relating to the world where you see agency, and I think this is the main point for animism, where you see agency beyond the human, agency or interiority, or all the qualities that we assume are human specific. For animism, and this is what Hallowell was saying, is that for animism, all these qualities like thinking, like will, like sociality, are beyond the human, and it is how do you call it? Um, it's a good way to relate to the. It's not a good way. Good is not the word, but appropriate. It's an appropriate way to relate to the world. So Hallowell took the term from Taylor and gave it kind of positive meaning. And then 20 years ago, in anthropology, they started to talk about the different ontologies. So what are ontologies? It's the way we understand the world. So, for example, there was Philippe Descola, which is a French anthropologist, and also Graham Harvey, a theorist of religion, and they started to put more value in animism, to say this is not just an appropriate way to relate to the world, but also what are the possibilities of animism in the midst of the ecological crisis. And I have this here, the definition that Graham Harvey gives of animism. I want to read it. Is that okay? He says, animists are people who recognize that the world is full of persons. So that's, I think, the main thing here. And I was saying that agency or interiority beyond the human, or sociality beyond the human. So animists are people who recognize that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in relationship with others. Animism is lived out in various ways that are all about learning to act respectfully towards and among other persons. Persons are beings rather than objects, who are animated and social towards others, even if they are not always sociable. And he continues in this book. This is a book from 2006, I think 2005. So to summarize, for me, animism is the recognition that you have persons beyond the human, and you have to find ways to relate to these other persons, which creates a more broad understanding of what is sociality, what is kinship, what is relatedness.
So in this description, two things that really stand out for me. One is how immediately, and this is one of the things I like about the term animism, is that we're confronted immediately with the colonial and oppressive histories that have led us to devalue the ways of knowing that are not associated with the dominant worldview. And the possibility or the need to recover the terms and the dignity from that history. So when we say animism, we're right away, that history is just resonating there. And many people still have those associations that it's talking about beliefs rather than ontologies. So that's one thing that listening to you really really resonates for me. And the other thing is that in many moments, to come back to the question of what animism and Buddhism look like in dialogue or in relation, that within that definition from Graham Harvey, there are pieces that sound like they could actually be spoken from a Buddhist perspective, the intense relationality, the need to be respectful, the awareness of interdependence, and also the possibility of multiple ontologies being simultaneously and equally valid. So I wonder what conversations start up for you when you're thinking about Buddhism and animism.
Mm. So first, I want to address the first thing that you say, because yeah, we have to be careful with the term, because sometimes when I talk with indigenous people here, for example, in Patagonia, the Mapuche people, sometimes they don't like the term. Uh, so they feel that the category and the term is used to simplify, no, their ontologies or their philosophies, and and I kind of agree with that, but I also feel that, that the term animism has something to say to us in the Buddhist communities, but also beyond the Buddhist communities. So that's something that I'm working on now, not, you know, in the chapter of the dissertation. How can we understand animism, having in mind that for many indigenous people, it's a term that simplifies, no, that yeah. So that's the first thing, and the second thing is that, or the second question or issue that you raised. So what will be the relationship, or how can we have a dialogue between Buddhism and animism? Yeah, first, I think the main term for me is relationality. Will you say relationality? Yeah. For example, there's an anthropologist in Colombia, Arturo Escobar. He doesn't call them, he doesn't call these ontologies animism, but he called them relational ontologies, ontologías relacionales, no? Where relationality is the main principle, and not entities or objects. So that's the first thing. The main point of contact, if we can say that, is relationality. We are dealing with, in Buddhism, with a process ontology or process philosophy where we see more process than objects. And in animism, it's very similar. You have a way to relate to the world where the, the, um, the way to relate to other is what creates an individuality. And that's something, for example, that Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, an anthropologist from Brazil, he called it perspectivism. You are because you relate to the other, and you are because the other has an image from you. So that's how you build your own identity. So I always have this thing when I relate Buddhism and animism, or when I try to create a dialogue, because in Buddhism we say there is no identity, the I or the me is an illusion, and there is no subjectivity. But for example, in the definition of that we read from Graham Harvey, there are persons. And it's important to recognize that there are persons that you relate to. But person is not, in animism and perspectivism, is not a separate object. It's in relationship that you create a person. So it's like in that relationship that emerges an identity. And that's very clear in Viveiros de Castro. He's I don't know if you have read him. He has a beautiful book called The Relative Native, or Native, The Relative Native. I think it's an amazing book. Or Cannibal Metaphysics. but he understands really well this kind of play between, for example, predator and prey, and how this kind of relationship, not just predator and prey, but also, for example, mutuality, build the interiority of each one in the relationship. So when we say person in animism, is not like what we try to deny in Buddhism. Can you remind me about like this thing that Tsongkhapa says, Jet Tsongkhapa, about the object to deny in Buddha, in when
Mhm.
we
The object to refute, gotcha. Mhm.
uh-huh, and what is what we try to deny?
The inherently existent or independently existent self.
Yeah, exactly. So that's not a, for that definition of animism, I will not say that's a person, because Buddhism will have problems with that kind of, if we understand person as an inherently independent entity, well, there are problems with Buddhism. But I think the notion of person, and how it emerges, is in relationship, and it's not completely stable. It can change all the time, and that's, for example, what happens with the shaman. You know, the shaman in an indigenous collective or indigenous people, that he can change his form, he can change his perspective to to bring the perspective, I don't know, of the tiger, of the bear, of other entities. And that is something really that I take from animism or perspectivism, is that this this creates um, what Deleuze called a plane of immanence, un plano de inmanencia, no? This creates like a field of continuity between all entities, where, and this is the most important thing for me from animism, where communication can happen beyond the human, between humans and other non-humans, because there is a plane of connection, you know. That interiority is not exclusive to humans. It's kind of difuminada. How do you say that? It's kind of
Distributed or
shared,
diffused. Mhm.
distributed, or shared in the in the whole spectrum of entities that are in a territory. So that kind of idea that you can have communication because there is something shared, and you can change perspectives, and it's depending on the place uh, where you stand, that you're gonna have a perspective. That's what I call perspectivism. It depends on your body. It depends. The perspective depends on how you manifest your body. I think that's completely not essential, no, not inherently independent. That's completely relational. So that's something that I think Buddhism and animism can relate to.
I wonder, when we're thinking about living these ontologies,
Uh-huh.
which means experiencing communication, dialogue, or relationship
Yeah.
with species and beings and persons that are not human.
Yeah.
And I have two questions around it. First, what does that communication look and feel like? How is it established? How is it experienced?
Yeah. Uh, I haven't had like a real conversation with a non-human or other than human, but just to have that open possibility of relationship. So, for example, I have here in the place where I live, I have a tree, and I sit in front of of the tree, of a cedar tree, and I did for him. I played the shakuhachi, this Japanese flute. So I play him or her, you know. And sometimes I feel something, you know, that the presence, that I feel a connection, I feel the aliveness. But just to have in mind that you are felt by other presences when you go to the forest, or when you go to the park. And to have that possibility open when you relate to the world, I think that's a beginning, and a big shift for many of us who are used to see the forest as something dead, or just something to amuse the human world or whatever. So just that, I think it's a big shift. And I don't know, like, I have learned this from the work that reconnects of Joanna Macy. It requires practice, you know, that kind of communication. For example, in the work that reconnects, that I practice with Fundación Reconectando in Colombia, and that I try to bring here also to Argentina, there are a lot of practices where you feel like kind of, will you say, like an imposter? like you're not real, you know, like, but it's practice, you know. It's to sit in front of the tree the most you can, and just be there, and practice to have a conversation, a wild conversation with another than human, uh, just to have first. And so I will say, first, I think it takes practice, and the most you practice, the more you practice, the more I think we're gonna feel that kind of relationship and communication. But second, just to have that seed on my mind that I am here, I am here by other entities in the world, by plants, by trees, by animals. Uh, so they hear me, and I can hear them. Just to have that possibility on my, it opens up my ontology. It kind of destroys or do something with the modern ontology that says everything is mechanic, everything is kind of dead. So I don't know, and it will be different for everyone, no? I think it will not be that kind of strategies and rituals to have communication beyond the human will be very different for each of us. We'll bring whatever gifts we have to that conversation. For example, I play the shakuhachi, or I sing the sutras, or I sing, or I read a book out loud, and that's something that we can bring more and more into the more than human world, you know. To practice with it, and this is very specific in with the Buddhist practices, to practice outside, you know, with the mosquitoes, with the worm, with the rain, I don't know, uh, to make it part of us. How do you see is that communication? What do you see?
Yeah, this is the thing, we want a technique, right? We want to know, how can I do this new thing that suddenly I learn is possible, which is very much sort of how we move forward through the Buddhist path, that we're acquiring tools, or we're learning new meditation techniques, and it's making new things possible for us, and so we keep going. Um, and that was not how I experienced uh, that at all. And I have a nephew who asked me this really great question about I do 3 months meditation retreat every year, and one time he asked me, it's all very mysterious to them what I do, but he asked me this incredible question, which was, "Are you trying to make something happen when you're meditating, or are you just waiting for something to arrive or arise?"
Hmm.
but this is one thing where Buddhist practice can really help, is to prepare us to stay present
Hmm.
and attentive to what might be there that we weren't aware of when we weren't paying attention.
Yeah.
So that's one of the ways I think that a Buddhist meditation practice is a really powerful tool in this work.
Hmm.
Um, and also patience.
Hmm. Totally. And I think I was thinking when you were talking about the place of grief in this work, because I think deep within us we know that we are we had this conversation, and indigenous people know that already, and that conversation beyond the human, that conversation with trees, with the wind, with the water, we know that deep within us, but we have lost that capability or that way to relate. And I think that is a grief that I take with myself, that I recognize in myself. Uh, and part of relating to the more than human world is to accept and to recognize, for me, it's to accept and to recognize that grief, that we don't have the words, that we don't have the songs yet, that we don't have the language. Uh, so we have to relearn how to listen first, then how to communicate. And I think a deep listening or deep listening is something where Buddhism can, how do you say, aportar? Yeah,
Contribute.
contribute. Yeah. So that's how I see my practice. I see my practice like the second option of your nephew, like to wait until something happens, like that kind of patience that you were saying, that kind of disposition towards the world. 2 days ago, here in Patagonia, there were snow, uh, and I was like, every copo de nieve, every
Snowflake.
flake, just waiting till the arrival of the earth, and,
Mm,
and I was like, I like that kind of image for meditation, that kind of waiting. That is an active waiting, you're not just like in the line of whatever, but just completely there, like that snowflake coming down to the earth. And for me, it's that kind of attitude or that we cultivate when we meditate. And for sure we really need that to be to have a broader conversation, because as you were saying, the words of the trees or the words of the forest or the presence of the animals, they are not going to be expressing in a human language. It's going to be another way of relating. So how can we learn that other way of relating that animism brings to our practice? And we have to learn how to be there, uh, without seeking anything. That's
mhm,
something that I
mhm.
really like from Buddhism.
Yeah, I'm feeling the words about loss um, quite vividly. The sense that these were relationships that we had at one point, that these were that we had kin
Hmm.
and we had orientation. We received instructions on how to be in relationship with them. We understood what that relationship asked of us, and we provided or didn't provide it, but there was that basic level of knowing what was appropriate.
Hmm.
And the loss of that, and I think for people who have come from European descendants whose connection to their land, whose indigenous original instructions were lost a long time ago, and who've wandered unaware, I think, of the fact that land had relationships to other people that were moving into that space, and the resonance of those broken relationships are going to be there. And then this longing that I think is very much of this moment for connection, for belonging. You know, we're so disconnected and cut off, and the logical conclusion of the mechanist understanding of ourselves has left us really so deeply impoverished in terms of our connectedness, and there is a great loss. And this, I think, sometimes in people's longing to re-indigenize or to reconnect with some sort of own ancestry or indigenous ways of being, and I'm thinking particularly about white people, that, you know, it has some of that longing or grief behind it. And then, you know, and a lot of the cultural appropriation can come because you want that, you know, without
Mm,
understanding that there's a way that it needs to be constructed that is going to be very different than just trying to insert ourselves in someone else's ontology and set of relationships.
mm,
You know, the grief and the loss
mhm,
is, I think, so much part of this work, and for myself, really just addressing it and looking at it clearly, and thinking about, okay, now what?
mm. Yeah. Yeah, I was writing the other day, and because I participated when I was in Colombia a month ago in an international event called Micelio del Alma, which brought many people to explore collective trauma, but eco-collective trauma. And we were kind of working through these four moments of the work that reconnects that was the legacy of Joanna Macy, and the second moment is honoring the pain of the world, for the world, of the world. And and I was remembering that one of the leaders of this of Reconectando, the people in Colombia that introduced the word that reconnects in Colombia, he was saying this is the main movement of the spiral for me, and it's so urgent that we address this in Colombia, but not just in Colombia. And this is something that we were exploring in our last talk. How can sanghas and Buddhist communities can open the space for that work with grief, for that work with loss? And for me, it's not very clear now. The places are and the sanghas that I have been, where I have been, I don't see they are interested in like approaching the collective grief, not just the individual grief, but the collective grief. Uh, but also, like what we were saying, that kind of loss where you feel you don't have the words and the songs and the images to communicate with the more than human world. So I think that's something we need to bring, to the Buddhist communities who are interested in, uh, and and especially I think the work that reconnects does a great work with bringing a methodology to address our disconnection with the earth. But also, it's not the only methodology. We need to create other methodologies. We need to create, as you were going to do in the retreat, that you are planning. Like, what can we do to address this special issue? And I think the entrance, the grief is a great door to entrance, to enter this work with animism, because we don't feel animistic. we were separated. We don't have the language. We don't have the images, the songs, the poems. So to bring back that will take a work with grief and with loss, and I think that's also very it can be hard to address that, but it's also beautiful. Uh,
Thinking about this lack of interest that you describe, which is also clear to me in many Buddhist communities in the collective work that needs to be done.
yeah,
I wonder if you could reflect on this tendency in how Buddhist practice is transmitted, in which our work is essentially individual. Even if we come together as a Sangha community, basically we each work on our own mind, we each work on our own cushion.
yeah,
You know, what sort of conditions do you think have allowed or ended up with Buddhism being so much focused on individual liberation as it's being practiced in
yeah,
the communities that we're familiar with now? What in the history of the transmission of Buddhism or the reception of Buddhism do you see that keeps the structural harms off the syllabus
yeah.
or
Hmm.
off the radar?
I don't know specifically, but I have a sense that our understanding of liberation itself, it's kind of a thing that we must address in the Buddhist world and the Buddhist communities. How do we see liberation? How do we see emancipation? Because usually, maybe like, I don't know, some people say, I know I'm Mahayana, Nirvana, and Samsara for me are the same, but in practice, it's not the same. And in the way they relate to the world, I don't feel that Nirvana and Samsara for many people with whom I practice were equivalent or whatever. So, but what sense of liberation do we have? And because I don't know, like if you ask people from, I don't know, the Mapuche people, I think they are not concerned with liberation uh, as Buddhism understands it, you know? They are concerned with keeping the harmony of the mundane, that it's also related to extramundane, but keeping the living conditions in a kind of a stable, not stable as a fixed thing, but with harmony. And that made me think a lot about my own view of liberation, because sometimes we feel in the Buddhist communities that liberation is transcending all material ties that we have with the world, with the world, with others. It's kind of an absolute solitude or an absolute omniscience. But if you are omniscient, you don't need relatedness. so so I have been thinking a lot about it, and I don't have an answer, but I think we should ask what we consider liberation, and if that's definite, in our Buddhist communities, and if liberation is something that we understand that take us out from the material conditions, I think there is a problem for a Buddhism that is ecologically responsible. I was reading the other day, mindfully addressing climate change. He's from the Theravada tradition, I think. He was saying something that made me think also about this issue, because he was saying that in order to implement practices ecologically responsible, we don't need immanence. We can still have a mindset that says we need to transcend samsara, but in order to transcend samsara, we need to practice in a, I don't know, ecologically stable planet, and so that's why we need to keep the planet stable. Kind of that is the argument, if I'm not wrong. Maybe I'm simplifying a lot, but kind of that is the argument. I'm not sure that that's what I want to follow in a ecologically or Buddhism, ecologically engaged Buddhism, you know. So I'm more with radical immanence, and to question that sense of liberation, where liberation is to transcend completely the ties with the material world, and also to question that kind of question in liberation, that the if we question liberation in that sense, we will also question and try to think also what we consider matter, you know, matter. um, so that's two things that I think we must address in the Buddhist world to to come to terms with ecology, to come to terms with how we can relate to animism, because animism is full immanence, kind of full immanence. Uh, so we are maybe we must address those two things: liberation and materiality, what we consider them. I don't know.
I do think there are ways of experiencing a recognizably Buddhist practice that is quite radically imminent in the way you describe.
Uh-huh.
And working with the notion of the bodhisattva path moving towards awakening, in which an awakening simply means continuing to be in relationship, to live with a radically heightened awareness to the conditions that one is existing within or interacting within, and having access to a commitment and wisdom in how to live that commitment, so that one is always responding appropriately in ways
Mm,
that are benefiting the collective.
mm,
And as a vision of what awakening might look like, or without going quite that sort of, without messing quite that much with the soteriological scheme, but recognizing that the bodhisattva path can be lived in that way, can be lived that that's where we are going, and developing the inner strengths and the qualities that we need to be able to live in our relationships better, more respectful, more humble, more patient, more attentive. Buddhism has so many ontologies within it, and so many ways of, so many different subject positions that we can take in so many different contexts. So I think
mm.
that I see good good material, good matter for doing that within Buddhist ontologies. But I think that's not the only way that Buddhism is done, of
No,
course.
no, I don't think so. I don't think so. Yeah, and also, uh, what that's one thing. Like, how can we understand soteriology, liberation, awakening? But also, the second thing that we must do, or we are invited to do, is to think about practices, specific practices. You know, to renew our relationship with the earth. Um, I don't know, like the Thich Nhat Hanh community has this practice of touching the earth. And in touching the earth, you recognize your ancestor, you recognize your teachers, but also you recognize the presence of the earth. And I think it was made by Thich Nhat Hanh. It was kind of wrote by him. So, and I'm really interested in my work, in my theoretical work, but also in my work living here, sometimes teaching, on these emergences. It's not just an emergence of a theoretical emergence, but also a liturgical or practical emergence, like how we create and innovate with the practices we have, yeah, but how can we bring something that address the ecological questions that the Anthropocene and the polycrisis are throwing to us. So one is the ontological and the philosophical, but the other is the innovation that we can bring, the innovation, but the recovery also that we can bring to our own practices. And that's a place where I'm very, very interested to see what people are doing, because that's how we transform, that's how we can transform our perspective. Not, yeah, with ontologies, we transform kind of the way we see the world, but with practices. What do we do in the Buddhist communities to become more animist? That's really a question.
Since we're thinking about practices and what we can do, I wonder if you would like to talk a little bit about what you're doing in your project in Patagonia.
Our project is called Gaia Refuge, or Refugio Gaia, Gaia Refuge, which is a practice of the work that reconnects, where you go to outside, to the forest or to a tree or to a park, and you establish a conversation with that being. So in that spirit, we created this place in Patagonia. The place where we are is called Epuyén. It's in front of the lake Epuyén. And so we're developing here a place where we can offer, meditation and practice, yoga in retreats, but also in classes. But also we are very interested in bringing, for example, art, So my partner, she's a photographer, and she's more into art than Buddhism or yoga. So we're bringing art, contemplative practices, and the body, the somatic experience. That for me is very, very, very important. And so that's what we are trying to do here in Patagonia. What I'm trying to do, for example, when I practice mindfulness of breathing, or just meditation with the breath, is to consider the breath and the air not just as an object of concentration, as sometimes and usually is considered. You focus on your breathing, or the physical sensation of the breathing of the breath, but also to consider this process as an act of recognition with Gaia. So I think every one of us know that the atmosphere was not created from scratch. It was created by the work of trees and forests and microbes and many, many beings, who created this kind of envelope where we are now. So the act of breathing, for example, for me, or what I try to bring to my practice, is an act of the recognition of generosity of Gaia, not just the focus of my mind that keeps me inside, but if I understand the atmosphere as the product, as the as the relationship actually of many, many, many beings that I am part of, that brings me into another relationship with the practice, I think. So that's how I am trying to understand the practices that I do from Buddhism, to see if we can relate with an ecological understanding those practices. For me, it's very connected, no, to think about Gaia and the process that Gaia brought to the atmosphere, and that's what I do when I breathe. And also, I play shakuhachi, and the act of playing the shakuhachi, the Japanese flute, it's it's also like a way to honor the air and the earth, you know. So it's kind of and it's very related to indigenous understanding of honoring the elements. So how can we in our practice have this understanding that it's in the practice, but sometimes we are so focused on developing, I don't know, or cognition into an attitude of attention that is super important, and we are okay with that, but we can broaden that understanding if we bring the ecological understanding, and that's what I like to, I don't know, explore in my practice. So,
From your description of this practice, one of the questions that I have is how can we hope to experience interdependence or interconnectedness, which effectively is what we expect will liberate us? How can
mm,
we hope to do that if we are not seeing and experiencing those connections beyond the human? How
mm,
could we hope to do that?
really. Mm. Yeah, how can we do that if we are still in an anthropocentric paradigm? I don't feel, I don't feel we can. I don't
Mm.
I don't see how.
Thank you so, so much for this conversation. It was beautiful to speak with you last time for the Spanish language YouTube channel, and I'm especially happy that your voice can now also be heard by English speakers.
So I asked the people if they came until this part of the interview. Thank you for making that effort that we always do in, in Latin America, in Spanish speaking countries. Like we need to like understand English and like understand the cultural setting of Buddhism. Like and and yeah, so thank you very much, Tamsho.
Thank you, Juan Pablo.